Warning. Before you watch this video, I should mention that although this pitch was conceived to be a prequel to my previous Madame Web Aranya pitch I made a while back, it might be wise to check out that video before this one, as events that occur within that pitch set up this entire shared universe to be a what-if concept of sorts, deviating from the timeline of the source material ever so slightly due to, in my opinion, a very clever plot point. Anyway, let's do this. So, cards on the table. I actually didn't hate the Kraven movie. I didn't love it, but I thought it was simply fine. I still agree that it shouldn't have been made, and I think Sony was absolutely insane for betting so much on its success, given their track record with Spider-Man-less Spider-Man movies so far. All in all, Kraven turned out to be a mid-ass paint-by-number wannabe John Wick clone. But just like Sony's other Spider-Man-less Spider-Man movies, I've decided to try my hand at cracking the Kraven origin formula, which they clearly misunderstood the assignment for. This, I pledge you right off the bat. Kraven will be a hunter, not a wildlife preservationist. Kraven will be an unabashed villain. You won't have to wait until the closing moments for Kraven to get his comics' accurate uniform. Also, don't expect to see a CGI man-rhino in this pitch, although Alexei Sitsevich has a bit role in human form, as I felt a CGI man-lizard worked much better for this concept. But this preamble is boring. We can talk more about the behind-the-scenes thought process in the outro. For now, let's start the pitch. The movie would open with a Russian Grand Duke named Nikolai Kravenov confiding in his friend, hunting buddy, and fellow Grand Duke Mikhail Nikolaevich about his increasing frustration with the Russian government. While they would talk, Nikolai's young son Sergei would brag to Mikhail's daughter Sasha about his own supposed hunting prowess, which would cause her to chuckle at his expense. Frustrated, Sergei would declare that he has a grand destiny that he would utilize his immense strength to realize within America, the land of opportunity. Though Sasha would continue to scoff at him, utterly turned off by his false bravado. Later, Nikolai would be shown being escorted, alongside his wife Anna and Sergei, to a vessel to sail them all to America across the Atlantic Ocean by Mikhail's mafia connections, headed by a man named Alexei Sitsevich, where the family would hope to use their financial fortune to have a fresh start. After the opening credits, Act 1 would start with a 20-ish-year-old Sergei conversing with the manager of Nikolai's estate. Their conversation would reveal Nikolai to have died recently, and that with Anna and Nikolai now deceased, the entire Kravenov estate would belong to Sergei. Sergei would look over the documents relating to the finances of the estate, scoffing about his father's poor business ventures and decision-making, which supposedly contributed heavily to much of the estate's loss of income. As Sergei and the estate manager would traverse the large property, all the while being watched by a certain female housekeeper, Sergei would look upon Nikolai's gaudy hunting trophies and would grimly order for the estate manager to liquidate all of his father's assets to provide him with however much cash remains. Sonia Smerdyakova, the housekeeper previously seen, would tearfully approach Sergei after the estate manager would depart, begging him not to leave her and her son Dmitri, Sergei's half-brother, with nothing. Sergei would coldly respond that his father always resented the two of them, only housing them out of a sense of responsibility for his greatest lapse in judgment. He would accuse Sonia of seducing Nikolai not long after Anna's mental breakdown and subsequent incarceration within a mental institute. Though Sonia would contest this, stating that Nikolai and she were in love, Sergei would flatly respond that she and her bastard are on their own now. The effeminate teenage Dmitri would then approach Sergei, pleading for his brother not to toss him and his mother aside like garbage. But Sergei would roughly shove him aside, stating that he's not worthy enough to call himself his brother. Sergei would later be seen preparing for a trip to Africa, thinking back to his previous boasts to Sasha about his hunting prowess, to spend what little money he received from Nikolai's estate on a grand hunting trip. On his way to the airport, he would explain to his driver that he planned to stalk a particularly fearsome lion that was the only beast to have ever bested Nikolai, to finally prove his worth. though would subtly hint with wordplay that he doesn't plan on ever returning from the trip, intending to either die during this hunt or take his life upon its conclusion. Once in Africa, Sergei would hire a man named Mwanga, an associate of Nikolai's whom the latter had helped off the African streets years ago when Mwanga was a mere 4 years of age, to serve as a guide while on the African safari, even coming to live alongside him and his family in his home village. Sergei would prove to be a natural hunter, greatly impressing Mwanga, with him claiming that Sergei's promise would have his skill rivaling that of Nikolai's after not too long. Throughout a montage, Sergei would come to feel alive and develop a sense of purpose while hunting, and eventually state a desire to best bigger and more formidable prey, such as the lion he always kept an eye out for. He would carve out a comfortable living, eating a portion of his kills and giving others to Mwanga's home village for its populace to enjoy, earning their favor. One day, while walking through the village, Sergei would spot a contingent of American soldiers roaming around the village he is staying in, and is told by Mwanga that they have come to deliver U.S. aid to the impoverished, though states that the gesture is meaningless as General Mwenya, a local African warlord, confiscates the relief packages within days of the battalion clearing out. Sergei and Mwanga would watch as one of the American soldiers with the name Connors labeled on his fatigues would show some of the younger villagers, including Mwanga's own son and daughter, Kwasi and Adoma respectively, kindness and generosity, gifting them with candy. Within the next few days, Sergei would develop a preference for hunting formidable beasts with nothing but his bare hands over conventional methods, viewing them as beneath him, and would come to be known by the locals as Kraven the Hunter. Mwenya and his men would soon arrive at and storm Mwanga's village just as predicted, roughing up the chief Okiro, and would confiscate large portions of the village's wares, including the relief packages from the American soldiers and some of the prey Sergei procured for them. At one point, Mwenya himself would confront a disgruntled and bravos Sergei, mocking his Kraven nickname, nearly leading to a confrontation, though Mwanga would interrupt their exchange, gifting the troublesome warlord with what additional finances his family had been saving in exchange for his new friend's life. During a later hunt, Sergei would finally come face-to-face with the lion that had bested Nikolai, it bearing the same distinguishing wound that Nikolai claimed to have caused before his ultimate failure, but would fall from a cliff wrestling it, separating him from Mwanga. Despite becoming severely injured, Sergei would finally succeed in slaying his mighty foe. Afterwards, while bleeding out, Sergei would close his eyes, supposedly succumbing to his wounds after looking at the animal's corpse with a confident expression, totally at ease, now having definitively proved his superiority. Sergei would unexpectedly awaken some time after, as Act 2 would unfold, to find himself in the middle of a healing ritual being performed by a beautiful woman introducing herself as Aja, the head of a makeshift voodoo moving commune on the outskirts of the African plains. She would reveal that her older sister Calypso had found him dying and carried him back to the commune to be healed, both sisters agreeing that he emanated an immense strength. Sergei would nonchalantly tell Aja that she should have simply let him die, as his purpose is now complete, but she would cynically mock killing a large cat as being a preposterous sole purpose in life, and would declare that she plans to finish healing him, at which time he can try again to end his life. Throughout Sergei's rehabilitation, Aja, Calypso, Aja's young son Takar, and other lesser members of the commune would endear themselves to him. During this time, Aja would explain that she and Calypso were born and raised in Haiti, but were exiled due to their mystical aptitude for voodoo, and that through a series of convoluted events, they ended up taking refuge in Africa, where they went on to form their commune to provide aid to the country's populace. Also during this time, Calypso would present Sergei with a vest made from the skinned head of the lion he had battled to the death as a gift, sinisterly flirting with him as she would help him into it. Though he would accept the gift, he would ultimately reject her advances, having begun falling for her sister instead. Over time, Sergei's feelings for Aja would grow to the level of love, which would in turn become reciprocated, both bonding over their shared experiences as outsiders in a foreign land, much to Calypso's mounting jealousy. Sergei would even begin to fulfill a father-like role in Takar's life, teaching the boy to hunt and help provide for the commune. Soon, after Sergei and Aja's relationship would evolve into that of lovers, she would become sickly before revealing herself to be pregnant with his child. Considering both this and his love for Aja, Sergei would realize that his death wish would have entirely subsided, with him now wrestling the idea of settling down permanently with Aja and Takar within the commune to live a life of peace. One day, sometime later, Mwanga and Kwasi would happen upon Aja's commune, relieved to see Sergei alive, claiming to have scoured the plains in search of him ever since his bout with the lion. Though Sergei would happily welcome them to the commune, Mwanga would hastily inform him that a mercenary sect of the American military apparently accepted a bribe from Mwenya and is now besieging their village. Mwanga would request Sergei's assistance with the matter, but Sergei would state his uncertainty with abandoning his new life of peace and prosperity to lead a revolt against a warlord, along with admitting to not being at 100% currently. But Mwanga would plead, asserting that he's been fervently searching for him all this time to request his aid in liberating his village and driving the mercenaries back out of Africa. Calypso would appear before the two men and convince Sergei to lend Mwanga's village his aid, volunteering herself to the cause too. As Sergei, Calypso, Mwanga, and Kwasi would prepare to set out for the village the following day, Takar would ready himself to tag along. Sergei would refuse to allow this, but Takar would point out that Kwasi, who's around his age, would also be marching off into danger too, though Sergei would ultimately persuade the boy to stay behind to watch over the increasingly pregnant and sickly Aja instead. When Sergei, Calypso, Mwanga, and Kwasi arrive at the village, finding the mercenaries besieging it just as expected, they would prepare for combat. Calypso would offer Sergei a potion she concocted to grant him the strength, agility, and acute senses akin to those of a jungle predator to compensate for his still injured state, but he would refuse the offer, not wanting any sort of artificial enhancements. Mwanga would suddenly apologize to Sergei before alerting the mercenaries to Sergei and Calypso's presence, solemnly admitting that Mwenya had been threatening his family's life in exchange for luring Sergei into a trap to be executed for his previous public display of rebellion. Sergei and Calypso would fight through numerous mercenaries, but would eventually be overwhelmed, with the former getting seriously wounded due to gunfire. Connors, the kind soldier Sergei previously saw showing the youths of the village kindness, would pull Sergei and Calypso to safety and convince them that he disavowed the actions of his comrades as un-American and wrong, though feels powerless to stop their greed and treachery. The soldier would officially introduce himself as a medic named Kurt and would begin treating Sergei's wounds, removing a bullet or two still lodged in his body, and would stop his wounds' bleeding. Calypso would then offer Sergei her potion once more, but this time he would begrudgingly accept it. Upon consuming it, he would immediately feel its benefits, though would also feel it wearing down his mental blocks, holding back his long-suppressed rage. Under the effects of Calypso's potion, Sergei would slaughter numerous mercenaries, along with several villagers, numb to the pain of his wounds and his body's overall limitations. During his rampage, he would spot Mwanga and angrily stalk toward him. Kwasi would attempt to intercept him, begging Sergei to spare his father's life, but Sergei would instead toss the boy aside, where his head would collide with the outside of his dwellings, rendering him unconscious. Sergei would then proceed to slaughter Mwanga in front of his terrified family, including Kwasi, who would awaken just long enough to weakly bear witness, despite his former friend's pleas that his betrayal was simply for the sake of his family and begging for their lives. Killing his former friend would cause Sergei's morality to begin bubbling to the surface, but the effects of the potion would be too prevalent, causing him to prepare to kill Mwanga's quivering family, though Calypso would suddenly shout to him that Mwenya's men are arriving at the village to reinforce the mercenaries and insisting that they must flee immediately. Sergei, Calypso, and even Kurt would fight their way out of the village. But along the way, Calypso would trigger a huge explosion to cut off their pursuers and cover their escape. The explosion would destroy a large portion of the village, causing numerous fatalities, including Okiro, Adoma, and Mwanga's wife, Isa, as well as blowing off Kurt's right arm. Seeing the destruction of the village and resulting injuries sustained by Kurt and the villagers, Sergei's morality would finally overcome his rage with great effort. Calypso would encourage the mentally struggling Sergei to flee back to the commune with her, but he would insist they take an unconscious Kurt with them, which she would reluctantly agree to. Act 3 would kick off with Moenia arriving at the remnants of the village some undisclosed time later, where he would survey the damage and loss of life, checking for Sergei amongst the corpses, though would obviously be unable to locate him. The surviving American mercenaries would tell Moenia that they've gone above and beyond their agreed-upon dealings, and that his personal vendetta against Kraven the Hunter is not their problem, as they are departing back to the U.S. One of Moenia's men would bring Kwasi to the warlord, who would tell the man that he knows where Sergei is, and would be more than happy to lead him and his men to his family's murderer. At the commune, Aja would attempt to question what happened at the village, but Sergei would snap at her that he doesn't wish to discuss it, though would immediately apologize for his tone. Kurt, regaining consciousness, would bemoan that he's going to die without the proper tools and medical expertise to treat his injury, and would state that he was planning on attending medical school after his tour was over. Sergei would have Calypso use her magic to heal Kurt to the best of her ability, and though she would agree to do so, she would have a mischievous tone to her voice and a devious look about her face. Sergei would then be seen caring for Aja alongside Takar, as her health would continue to deteriorate, while Calypso would have Kurt ingest a formula at the same time, which would cause him great distress. Kurt would suddenly transform into a humanoid lizard creature and burst out of Calypso's hut, which would cause a mass panic. He would slay several commune dwellers, which would catch Sergei's attention. Sergei would start toward the feral creature, preparing to engage it in combat, but ultimately would head into Calypso's hut instead. Calypso would quickly attempt to make excuses for what went wrong with Kurt's treatment, though Sergei would sharply cut her off, demanding more of her potion, obviously now addicted to its effects. Calypso would smirk as she would hand him another potion already prepared. After consuming this potion, Sergei would use its effects to overcome the lizard after a fierce battle, which Aja would witness, horrified by the brutality of the man she loves. She would shout to him just as he would be about to deliver a killing blow to the lizard, and would proceed to talk him down. While Sergei would be distracted, the defeated creature would transform back into Kurt, albeit maintaining several lizard-like attributes. Sergei would walk off into the arms of Aja after a brief mental struggle, leaving the bloody and bruised Kurt sprawled out on the dirt, while Calypso's face would betray obvious irritation at this resolution of events. Sergei would tearfully bemoan the darkness in his heart to Aja, afraid of one day becoming a danger to those within the commune. She would convince him to undergo a mystical Yansanan ritual, which would entail her utilizing various herbs and potions to render him in a state of darkness for 2 weeks, wherein he would have the opportunity to overcome said darkness. Sergei would enter the coma-like state from the ritual just as Calypso would angrily confront Aja for supposedly manipulating him into agreeing to it, shouting at her sister that Sergei's darkened state was a blessing for those within the commune, as it would enable him to protect them all from potential dangers, as evidenced by his response to the lizard's rampage. Days later, Calypso would ominously be shown beginning a ritual of her own, while Aja's well-being would take a steep decline, fully revealing the latter's suffering to be a byproduct of her sister's black magic. Sergei would also suffer from effects brought on by Calypso's ritual, as within his subconscious, he would be buffeted by a storm of darkness, causing him to see a manifestation of his mother within the mental institute, screaming as hordes of spiders would be seen descending upon her. Back within the waking plane, Moenia's men, led by Kwasi, would arrive at the commune and begin attacking those dwelling there, causing Calypso to accuse Aja of dooming them all since Sergei wouldn't awaken from his coma for more than a week. Seeing no alternatives, Kurt would tell Calypso to use the lizard formula to transform him once more so he can do what he can to protect those within the commune. She would comply with his wishes after informing him that he might not be able to turn human again afterwards, as the formula's effects would completely take hold of him after only 1 or 2 more doses. Kurt would struggle to control his monstrous form, guiding it with great effort into only targeting Muenya's men, while Aja and Calypso would order for the other commune dwellers to barricade themselves indoors. Within Sergei's mindscape once more, he would be confronted by a manifestation of Nikolai, who would make the observation that Sergei's mind had always been warped by an inner darkness that repeatedly caused harm to everyone around him throughout his entire life. Sergei would retort at the apparition that it was his own infidelity and poor treatment of Anna that had led to her depression and eventual suicide, shouting that he has no right to judge his own darkness. Nikolai's apparition would hint that Sergei was involved in his death, and while the latter would initially deny this, he would end up admitting it to be true when pressed, proceeding to justify his actions. Nikolai would continue pressing until Sergei would wrap his hands around the apparition's throat, squeezing in blind rage until his father would disappear in a sudden puff of smoke. Sergei would awaken from unconsciousness soon after. Outside, the lizard would be shown killing several of Muenya's men until he would eventually be overtaken and beaten into submission. The assault upon him would very nearly kill him, causing him to revert into his humanoid persona, looking even more lizard-like than when he last reverted. Wishing to draw out Sergei, Muenya's men would tear their attention away from Kurt to pursue Aja instead. But while attempting to force their way into her hut, Sergei would menacingly approach them. Aja and Calypso would both reel in shock, covertly peering at him, confused how he awakened from his coma-like state within mere days. Wordlessly, Sergei would systematically murder every last one of Muenya's men with unbelievable brutality. Though Kwasi and most of Aja's commune would watch in horror, Calypso and Takar would look on with awestruck expressions. Kwasi would immediately turn tail to flee for his life, but Sergei would pounce on him and ready a single killing blow until Aja would dash out of her hut, begging Sergei to stop. This would make him snap out of his seemingly hypnotic bloodlust and look over his blood-soaked self, along with the numerous dead bodies scattered about, in terror. Sergei would shoot Aja a wrathful look and angrily stomp toward her, arms shaking from potion withdrawal, as Kwasi would take the opportunity to get away. He would roughly grab her, furiously blaming her ritual for turning him into a monster, shouting that she had told him that her ritual would help rid him of his inner darkness, not enhance it. Her water would then break, Sergei's fury causing her to go into stress-induced early labor, so Calypso would help deliver the baby, while Sergei and Takar would wait outside the hut. Takar would attempt to find comfort with his new father-like figure, as his mother's screams would fill his ears, but the latter would ward him off with a look of disgust. Once the baby would be successfully delivered, Aja would slowly expire with Calypso cursing her for supposedly having everything that should have been hers instead. Afterwards, Calypso would stare at her sister's body, gloating that she wasn't about to allow her to have Sergei too. Calypso would then leave the hut, feigning grief, and hand the infant off to Sergei while delivering news of Aja's death. While Takar would become inconsolable, Sergei would clench a fist in frustration while looking distantly at his new son with a blank expression. Calypso would lean in, pretending to seek comfort with Sergei, but would be roughly rebuked as the latter would thrust the child back into her embrace, declaring his name to be Alexei. Though Calypso would attempt yet again to console Sergei, he would gruffly interrupt with orders for her to produce as much potion as she has the materials for. He would state that he would plan to use the effects of the potion to storm Muenya's compound and utterly crush the warlord's organization. As Calypso would walk off to prepare the brew, Sergei would turn to the sobbing Takar and admonish the boy for his tears, telling him that he'll never be a man until he's able to bury his emotions. Sometime later, after Calypso would have finished concocting the potion Sergei requested, she would attempt to leave her hut, but would find the latter blocking the entrance, glaring menacingly at her with a cowering Kurt at his side, led by a makeshift chain leash. Kurt would whimper, begging Sergei for mercy, but Sergei would yank on the man's leash, immediately quieting him, before subtly accusing Calypso of orchestrating Aja's death. Calypso would plead her innocence, continuing to beg for Sergei's mercy, but Sergei would callously unveil some lizard formula and forcibly transform Kurt, despite the man's whimpering protests that he'll completely lose the remainder of his humanity if he transforms this final time. Afterward, Sergei would use the lizard's ferocity to vaguely threaten Calypso's life, causing her to finally, tearfully, admit to using Aja's life force to empower her black magic. She would crawl over to Sergei on her hands and knees, trying in vain to convince him that everything she did was out of love for him, and would claim that she knows he loves her deep down just as much. Calypso would spitefully curse Aja's name for standing in the way of this supposedly shared love. As Calypso would begin grabbing at Sergei, he would shove her backward and callously let go of the lizard's chain, allowing the feral creature to use its claws to fatally rip her apart and eat her innards. Stepping over them both, Sergei would fill a large gourd full of potion. Upon exiting the hut, Sergei would order Takar, who would be waiting just outside, to hand off Alexei to other members of the commune, and would tell him to grab his hunting rifle. Sergei would then have the boy follow him, but when asked where they would be going, would simply respond, "Hunting," while consuming the potion. Perspective would shift to that of Muenya's chamber within the warlord's compound. He would brag about Sergei's presumed death with those of his men surrounding him, gloating that no one is allowed to show him such blatant disrespect and keep their head. Desiring refreshments, Muenya would call for some of his underlings outside his chamber, but would receive no answer, causing him to grumble his frustrations to those around him. Suddenly, a rising commotion would sound out from outside the chamber, followed by screams, until finally the chamber's extravagant doors would burst open, and Sergei would march through, alongside the chained lizard, with a trail of blood and bodies behind them. The two of them would proceed to murder everyone within, save the terrified Muenya, before Sergei would call for Takar from the direction he had come, bidding for the boy to enter the chamber also. Once Takar would appear, armed with his hunting rifle, Sergei would order him to shoot Muenya dead, but though Takar would aim the firearm at the warlord, he would ultimately falter, unable to pull the trigger. Sergei would strike Takar, calling him a failure, before taking his rifle and aiming it at Muenya himself, though as his finger would ready to pull the trigger, he would suddenly reconsider and toss the weapon aside. Sergei would instead decide to kill Muenya with his bare hands, just as he used to with his animal prey, which had originally earned him the Kraven mantle, and would proceed to lift the warlord off the ground before using his fingers to open the man's throat with depraved glee. After the carnage, Sergei would steal a jeep from Muenya's now vacant compound, while Takar would attempt in vain to apologize to him for his previous inability to take a human life. Sergei's only response would be to order the boy into the jeep before they would drive off back to the commune together, with the lizard chained up in back. When Sergei, Takar, and the lizard would arrive, Sergei would tell Takar to stay in the jeep with the lizard, while he himself would collect the remaining amount of potion along with baby Alexei. Upon returning to the vehicle afterward, they would all drive off once more. Eventually, Sergei would park in the middle of the plains and usher Takar out of the vehicle. He would then declare that from then onward, the confused boy's name would be rechristened as Gregor, delighting him. Sergei would hand Alexei to Gregor, while further telling him that although both half-brothers would have names befitting his sons, they would still need to earn the Kravenov mantle. He would also announce to Gregor that he would be returning to his homeland of Russia to make a name for himself, now bearing more worldly experience under his belt. Gregor would be told that his adopted father would return to Africa within 2 years' time, during which he and Alexei would be expected to survive together, doing whatever they must to accomplish this, as would be becoming of any true Kravenov. Gregor would start to question how he could possibly be expected to keep himself and Alexei alive for 2 entire years, but Sergei would throw the boy's rifle at his feet and respond that he would have to abandon anything and everything holding him back, including morality and emotions, to do whatever it would take to press onward. As Sergei would start driving away, he would shout to Gregor strong insinuations that he should hone his tracking and killing skills by seeking out Kwasi, wherever he may be. After a few closing credits would roll, we would see Sergei returning to his family's previous Kravenov mansion property in Russia, currently the possession of the now elderly and disabled Mikhail, alongside his daughter Sasha, acting as his grumbling caretaker. Sergei would announce that as heir to the Kravenov name, he would be planning to rebuild his family's legacy stronger and better than ever, starting with reacquiring his family's old home. Mikhail would attempt to reprimand Sergei for such insolence, but Sasha would surprisingly defend him before murdering her father and bequeathing the property to the latter, showcasing obvious romantic flirtations as she does so. Mikhail's mafia bodyguards, confused by the commotion, would burst into the room, causing Sasha to murder them too. Sergei would signal to the lizard outside, and together, the three of them would begin a murder spree amongst the remaining bodyguards until only Alexei Sitsevich would remain. Alexei would be quick to kneel and swear loyalty to Sasha and Sergei in exchange for his life. Sasha would wrap herself around the satisfied Sergei and marvel at what a man he's become as the camera would pan out and fade to black. Once the credits would finish in their entirety, Sergei would be seen drinking potion while watching a survivalist program on TV, starring himself after an obvious passage of time. He would grunt in frustration as it would be interrupted by a news report depicting a heroic yet brutal exploit from a mysterious black-suited Spider-Man alongside several of his cohorts, causing Sergei to turn off the television just as Sasha would enter the room. Sergei would brag about his growing celebrity status, with his accomplishments being marveled at all across the globe. But Sasha, while placating his ego, would unfold a large map of the world atop a table in the middle of the room. She would point to a location on it and announce that their purchase of a certain isolated island in the Caribbean that would come to serve as the site of the greatest hunting grounds of all time would almost be finalized. Sergei would take another swig of potion with a sinister smirk, while a ghostly spirit of Calypso would be shown manipulatively whispering words of encouragement in his ear as the scene would come to an end. Well, that's it. That's the entirety of the pitch I came up with for a Kraven the Hunter origin film. When I began the research into this project, I was surprised at how segmented and uninspiring a lot of his backstory actually was, so I knew I would have to take more liberties with its depiction than I originally thought. But all in all, I'm pretty satisfied with how this pitch turned out. Every character mentioned within are pulled directly from the comics, each originating within a Spider-Man or Spider-Man adjacent issue, meaning that theoretically, the Sony Spider-Man-less Spider-Man universe should have had access to them. Speaking of the characters within the pitch, I wanted to touch a little further on the mercenary faction of the US soldiers featured. I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the narration by listing off the individual members, but I will list some off now. The first soldier of note would be Bruno Granger, a hot-headed helicopter pilot that I envisioned periodically seen bullying the sympathetic Kurt Connors throughout their appearances. He would definitely become a casualty of Kraven's potion-induced wrath during his initial rampage throughout Mwanga's village. Speaking of casualties, another ill-fated member of the mercenary faction would be the crazed Gordon Thomas, aka Typeface, a soldier with numerous letters of the alphabet inexplicably tattooed all over his body. He would launch projectile weapons, such as throwing knives and grenades, all painted with the same crude letters as depicted in his tattoos. One of his grenades would be utilized by Calypso when causing the massive explosion that devastates the village. Being at the epicenter of said explosion would be the cause of his aforementioned demise. This explosion would also be the cause of a third soldier of note losing 2 fingers on his left hand. This soldier's name would be Lee Price for all you modern Venom fans. Lee would miraculously make it out of Africa alive to possibly be featured in a forthcoming interconnected Venom pitch. The Jury would be another Venom adversary set up through the mercenary faction. Though the old school team wouldn't be featured within this pitch, their leader, Orwell Taylor, would be the commanding general of the mercenaries. His new recruit son, Hugh, would also be featured as a lesser member of the faction, alongside Hugh's best friend, Sam Calkin, aka Ramshot. All three would join Lee in abandoning Mwenye's vendetta against Kraven and leaving Africa with their lives. One last thing I'd like to tease before closing this video out would be a preview of what lies in Kraven's future in this series of interconnected Sony rewrite videos. Well, upon concluding Aranya's storyline, which will continue in a silk pitch before concluding with a self-titled sequel, I plan to feature the epic return of Kraven in an Avengers-style web-slingers team-up pitch, featuring all the various Spider Family characters in play by that point, getting kidnapped and brought to Kraven's newly purchased Caribbean island, where they will be systematically hunted by Kraven and his extended family, having to survive not only the fearsome hunters, but also mutated animal-based Spider-Man villains as additional feral obstacles, including the Rhino and Lizard. Calypso's influence over not only Kraven, but his entire family would also come to a climax. This future pitch would take heavily from the Grim Hunt and Great Hunt storylines, additionally borrowing significant story beats from Kraven's Last Hunt and a Punisher storyline called Hunter Hunted. So does that sound good? Then go ahead and sub it up. Also, like and comment on this video to help me out. I always love to hear your guys' thoughts and love talking to you all. Next video will be a return to Battinson content, with me theory crafting the incorporation of Hush as a major antagonist in the hotly awaited upcoming The Batman Part 2. So stay tuned to my channel for that. Now if you click on the video that just popped up to the left, you can view another villain-centric pitch with my rewrite of Joker Folie à Deux, and click on the video that popped up below it to check out my rewrite pitch for Madam Web, which serves as a sequel to this current video. Now ciao, my guys. Until next time.